Welcome back to Brothers in Cars. I'm Rob Akins. This is my brother, Fred Akins. Fred's a longtime auto industry veteran, wore many hats, and I'm just a guy who likes cars. So we get together and we talk about topics that we find interesting. Hopefully, you find interesting too. And you can see that background's a little different from our past videos. For me, I'm at the Northern Command up here in northern Wisconsin at our cabin. Fred's in Monterey, California. And so, Fred, one of the things that I found really interesting over the last few years is the statistics about Gen Z not being in a hurry, statistically anyway, to go out and get their driver's licenses as soon as they turn 16. For us, I think that was something we looked forward to for years. And as soon as we had the opportunity, we were getting ready to get behind the wheel, getting our driver's ed, driver's training done. A lot of the time that was offered through the schools. Some places it still is, some places it's private. But statistically, there's been a big drop among kids wanting to have their own car and drive themselves wherever they want to go. And you have a little experience with this with your granddaughter. And why don't you tell us about how that went?
Well, actually, our granddaughter, Madeline, is now 22 and still doesn't have her driver's license, which stunned me because initially she was very much like you and I were and our sister, which was, okay, I can't wait to turn 16 so I can get my driver's license, because we were conditioned growing up that your driver's license was your first step on the road to adulthood. And it was your first tangible evidence of freedom and freedom of mobility. But I think kids today have a very different concept of freedom. Um, they're actually kind of afraid of it,
Mm-hmm.
and their parents, or in our case, grandparents, haven't exactly helped that by almost trying to wrap them in bubble wrap
Yeah.
for as long as humanly possible and protect them from all of the bad things that can happen. And yes, a lot of bad things can happen with teenage drivers. It's dangerous being a teenage driver, which is one of the reasons I'm a volunteer for a teen driving course that we just did at the end of last weekend in January. And there were, I think, probably about 25 to 30 kids who went through it. And my granddaughter Madeline was supposed to be one of them, but there was a miscommunication on what car she'd be using, etc. And so she wasn't able to participate. So my student during the class was a 17-year-old high school senior, came up from northern San Diego County all the way up to Pasadena, which, I mean, that's a real time commitment. But he and dad came up and went through the course. He was driving a Subaru Impreza, I think 2012 or so. So not the newest cars out there. There was one kid who was doing the course in a BMW iX EV,
Mm-hmm.
which was interesting in its own right. But the one thing that these kids get out of the course like that is, in a controlled environment, they get to experience things that they don't get during quote unquote normal driver training. They get to feel a little bit of the car at the limit, panic braking, where they really get into the ABS, which is something I recommend for every kid who is learning to drive, because it's a weird sensation for the kids. But I think you touched on something with respect to anxiety, and more so for the girls than for the guys. but I think we've raised a generation of kids that are much more anxious about the world at large, and driving in particular. And part of that is the 24/7 news cycle. Because now, if something bad happens to a young person, especially a young girl driving on her own or driving out there, and let's say something really bad happens, it used to be if something bad happened, it was just in your town, and that's where the story stayed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if something bad happens in a small town in New York or Ohio or Wisconsin, suddenly it goes viral and goes national. And so there's so much more information, especially negative information, because we know negative news travels a lot farther and faster than positive stories. You get all this negative feedback and it winds up on Instagram or TikTok or other social media.
Right. And one of the things that we had been talking to before we started the video, or talking about before we started the video, was for generations, and certainly our generation growing up in the 70s and 60s, 70s, 80s, that our first kind of step on the ladder of independence was a bicycle. And our parents would tell us to go outside and play and go find something to do. And no cell phone, no tracking device.
Exactly. You and I and our sister were raised as what I call free range kids.
Yeah.
Which is, okay, you're not in school, you're home from school, leave the house, and don't come back until the street lights come on or sunset.
Right. And our parents had no idea where we were, but they trusted us to mostly stay out of trouble, and knew that maybe we were at a friend's house or with other friends, and they trusted our
Fools.
friends. Yes.
But no, that's just the way it was. And
right. So we got comfortable with that.
Yeah. Well, we were raised with that, from a fairly young age. Now you can't have our house in Southern California is right across the street from a park. When our son was 10, 8, 9, 10, he'd ask if he could go over to the park. And we would, okay, go over there, but stay where we can see you. Mm-hmm. Now, that was a difference from our parents. Our parents didn't even need to be able to see us.
Right. They'd drop us off at a park if it was far away.
Yeah. It's like, say, okay,
we'll be back in a few hours.
I'll pick you up at this time. And somehow miraculously it all worked out.
Yeah.
But now you've got parents that have that are so sort of helicopter parents. And of course, every kid over the age of about 10 or 12 now has a cell phone, and there's usually a tracking app that you can find your kid, and more or less what they're doing. So we've indoctrinated the kids to being, continually surveilled.
Right. And connected.
And that was the other thing with my granddaughters. The worst thing you could do, and I think even with my kid when he was growing up, the worst thing you could do is take away his cell phone.
Yep.
It's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
This handheld device that supplanted, I think, in many ways, the car as their symbol of freedom. I have a cell phone. I have a smartphone. I can do whatever.
Right, which kind of leads me into this article that was in USA Today earlier this year about why Gen Z is likely or less likely to have a driver's license. And the author does talk about technology. Um, Increasing access to technology is one reason people are opting out of driving. Teenagers find community online and can connect with friends anytime they please. So for us, the closest thing we had to that was a corded telephone that came out of the wall that we didn't know who was calling. They didn't know who was calling on the other end. And so you couldn't screen your calls and whatnot. And so that was a way to talk to our friends. But if we wanted to interact, have any visual face-to-face time, share anything, we had to do it in person. And so now there are so many more options for kids to have some kind of social interaction and quasi face-to-face time with their friends and so forth, that they don't have to leave the comfort of their own bedrooms in many cases, which is another psychological has psychological ramifications we're not going to get into right now. But as far as driving is concerned, there's not as much reason to get out of the house and go find your friends. And
Right.
sometimes we didn't know where they were. We drive around until we found a group of people we knew, and we'd hang out.
Or we'd meet at the mall, or we'd meet at, the pizza place or whatever. It was very much a model from the 50s and 60s, as opposed to the the 2000s and 2010s. And so there's that. Now I will say, the 22-year-old, she is in the process of getting her license, but she's had to renew her driver's permit at least twice because it's expired.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my next two grandkids, boy who's 16, he's got his license because he needs to be able to, go to work. Although I think usually he takes his bike or he walks because gas is expensive and their family doesn't have multiple cars waiting in the driveway. His 16-year-old sister is in the process of getting her license. But the joke is the 16-year-old will have her license, or she's about to turn 17. She'll have her license before her sister, her 22-year-old sister. So go figure.
Yeah, and so I think you made an interesting point, because your younger grandchildren live in Indiana, right?
Bingo. There's the
Right.
difference.
And so one of the next part of this article is saying that a lot of kids have been able to, if they need mobility and they need independence, they can call an Uber or a Lyft and as a one-off, go to school, get to work, get home. Or they also, if they're in an area that has better public transportation or is conducive to riding a bike or walking, they can do that. But I think there are some statistics that were kind of interesting, that between 83 and 2022, about a 40-year window, number 16-year-olds with driver's licenses declined from about a half to a quarter, which is kind of crazy that only about a quarter of 16-year-olds have driver's licenses. At the same time, 18-year-olds with driver's licenses dropped from 80 to 60%. And this is just a graph of back in 2000, 2.83 million licensed drivers were 18-year-olds, and that's now gone down to down a little bit more than 10% over 22 odd years. But then 16-year-olds in 2000, 1.47 million. In 2022, when they last had the data, was 107. So that's about a 30% drop. So that's kind of interesting. And the other thing that I thought was kind of telling, or at least intriguing, was the difference based on geography. And maybe some of it going back to what the article mentioned earlier about public transportation. States that are more uh, built out when it comes to public transportation, like the Northeast or urban areas, kids do have more options. And driving a car can be a hassle when you're in an urban environment or a more dense environment, because you have to find parking, you have to navigate more crowded roads, traffic, a little bit more intimidating if you're driving into a city, etc. But one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting, I'm in Wisconsin, and so the change in licensed drivers 19 and younger between 2012 and 2022. So Wisconsin is about 9% of current drivers are 19 and younger. California, it's it's down 7.9%. Um, and you would think, California is a big old state. It's people who may live in other parts of the country don't always appreciate how spread out things are in California. And there used to be a song, "Nobody Walks in LA."
Exactly.
You would get in your car if you had to drive around halfway around the block, or if you were in one part of a shopping center, you might even drive to another part of the shopping center just so your car was closer to you. So, what are your thoughts about what you see in California?
Well, yes, it's more crowded. It now takes, depending on time of day, it will take you a couple of hours to go 40 miles. Where you are in Wisconsin, to go 40 miles is basically a half an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're way out in the hinterlands. Um, in Southern California, 40 miles doesn't even get you out of Orange or LA County.
Yep.
You're still in the same county. And that's the scale. The other thing is, sometimes a 15-mile drive takes 15 minutes. Sometimes that same 15-mile drive will take you an hour.
Yep.
At the wrong time, or
And you can't tell what it's going to be sometimes until you either check your traffic app or you get on the road.
and then you go, oh.
Yeah. And yeah,
And
drive.
the other side of that coin, and the other reason I think that younger people, I mean, when you and I were growing up, mom and dad were able to add us to their insurance for a relative pittance, maybe $100-$200 for the year.
Mm-hmm.
Now we had our granddaughter on our insurance policy for 1 year so that she could build up a history of being insured. That 1 year, and she wasn't authorized in all of the vehicles that we had in the household. She was authorized on basically an older Audi crossover. $2,600, more than my wife and myself combined in across all of our vehicles.
Right.
And so if you've got somebody who, like my wife and I have done, we said, okay, we'll give you a vehicle to drive. We'll make a vehicle available, but you got to pay for the insurance. Well, all of a sudden, you're having to work a couple of months just to pay for the car insurance.
Right. And some kids just say, no, not worth it.
Yeah. And in our granddaughter's case, she would have boyfriends or friends who did have the car, did have the insurance, and okay, I'll just get a ride with you. Or I'll dial up on my smartphone, Uber or Lyft, if I need to.
or mom and dad, grandma and grandpa are available to chauffeur them.
Yes, I have served as Papa Burr.
And so I just want to touch on this one more topic here. We kind of talked about it, was the anxiety. And so driver anxiety is another reason why young people are less motivated to get their license. Last year, the Washington Post reported that incidents of road rage and aggressive driving were on the rise. Increased hostility on the road, matched with a mental health crisis among teenagers, can make this rite of passage an anxiety-ridden experience. Now, we've all been in traffic. We've all maybe we've cut somebody else off, or and done it unintentionally. We didn't see them, or we were driving too aggressively, maybe. But we've had other people do it to us, and especially if you're on the receiving end of road rage, where somebody honks at you, glares at you, flips you the bird, kind of jumps, they pull their car aggressively in front of you and so forth. I could see, even in my 50s, there are times when that is a little bit unnerving. Now, I'm not worried about getting into a physical confrontation, but it still can raise your blood pressure and your anxiety. And for a young driver, especially a young female driver, I could see how that would be something that they aren't in a hurry to experience. And they may even think about and say, I don't really want to go there. So I'm going to either not get my license, or I'm going to drive as little as possible.
Well, and that's part of it, especially um, with younger girls, younger females. And this is something that we, at least I have in the past, in the teen driving courses, we specifically work with the young ladies to make them feel more comfortable behind the wheel, but also to coach them on, if they're out there by themselves without mom or dad, and they get into a situation where somebody is being aggressive toward them, we would coach them. Here are some strategies to, disengage, back off. And if somebody starts following you, because unfortunately, especially in Southern California, there have been reports of, follow home attacks. There have been reports of, and again, this is part and parcel of a 24/7 media news cycle, where if something happens, it gets played up and overblown a little bit in the media, as if, to give the impression that this is always happening. Yes. It might be a one-off, but especially if there's any kind of video footage, and now of course everybody's either got dash cams or cell phone video. Mm-hmm. And you see some of these road rage incidents, and the young ladies especially are just petrified that this will happen to them. Statistically, the numbers say you're more likely to be struck by lightning.
Right.
But
that's not the perception.
But that's not the perception, and perception becomes reality.
So what would you tell a young lady who gets in a situation to do, where she might be able to find a safe place or diffuse the situation?
Well, one of the people I used to coach with, she was female, former race car driver, and she'd been doing this for many, many years. Her advice to the young ladies was, if somebody was really following you, you either find out where the police station is and you pull up right in front of the police station and you sit there, and maybe you honk your horn. Mm-hmm. And you get a couple of big burly officers with their tactical vests and everything. All of a sudden, your bad guy is going to decide that it's not worth his time anymore.
Right.
Or, failing that, one of the other recommendations was to either pull up to a hospital emergency room bay where they back up the ambulances, because they will come out and they'll, because that's their job. They come out and they assess the situation. And if you're actually having an emergency, in which case somebody is threatening you, that's a good place to go and sit and get help.
Yeah, good strategy.
Or the last one she recommended, I hadn't even remotely thought of this. Go to a shopping center, a grocery store, because they all have usually a handicap ramp right by the front doors. Front doors open automatically. Pull your car up right to the front doors. So you're basically blocking the entrance. Well, somebody from the store, a manager, is going to come out and go, "What the heck are you doing?" At that point, you roll down your window a little bit and you explain, "Well, this car has been following me for the last 5 miles. Would you mind, helping to make me safe?" And again, your average bad guy is going to go, "Okay, all of a sudden the equation has changed, and this is no longer, bumping into somebody on a back road someplace where they can do God knows what. Now it's, okay, I got a lot of witnesses."
Yeah.
And
fire department would work too.
Right. They've seen me. They've seen the car.
Yeah.
Again, fire department's a great example. Yeah.
Just pull up in front of the bay. They'll come out and say, "Why are you blocking the..."
Right. As Mr. Rogers always told us, look for the helpers.
Yeah.
And that works.
That's good advice. All right. Well, we could go on and on about this, but I think we've covered a lot of good ground. And my question to anybody who's watching the video is, when did you get your license? And do you have kids? And when are they planning, or when did they get their licenses? And how did you encourage them to get out and be independent? And what kind of driving do they do? Do they drive to work? Do they drive to practice? I coach baseball and softball players, and I can tell you in Green Bay, Wisconsin, probably at least 90% of the 15 and 16-year-olds I coach are coming to practice either with their parents driving the vehicle. They are driving the vehicles with their parents, so they're on their permit, or as soon as they turn 16, they are getting their license and they're driving themselves to practice, to school, and so forth. So I see a higher percentage, I think, maybe because it's a more rural part of the country, but I see a higher percentage of Gen Z wanting to get their license, and both boys and girls. So interesting, but I'd like to know where you live and what your experience has been.
And, being in the car business, I get the question a lot from parents of my kids' friends, my grandkids' friends, etc. What's a good car for a new driver? And that might be a topic for another time. But basically, I usually say, well, just, get them something that's not too much vehicle for them. So in other words, you don't buy them a sports car. And I live in a fairly affluent area. So some of my kids' friends have had, very high performance cars, Corvettes, Porsches, high-end BMWs. That's not generally the car you want junior learning on, because kids are going to make mistakes. You also don't get them Jeeps. God, no, don't get them a Jeep or something else with a high center of gravity.
High center of gravity, and you need, as a parent, to take the time to either have them attend a driving school like the one you participate in, or at the very least take them out in an area that is a big parking lot or some more rural roads where you're not going to have a lot of other traffic, and teach them what it feels like when you activate the ABS and not to panic when you feel the shuddering and the
Yes.
pumping through the brakes,
Well,
and how to brake before you make a turn as opposed to braking right when you're entering a turn.
yeah,
All those
jumping
things.
on the brakes in the middle of a turn because you overcooked it going in.
Correct.
Um, and where you live, you also have to worry about driving in really inclement weather.
Right.
In other words, snow and ice and heavy
So,
rain.
yeah.
We don't get that much of that in out in California.
Right. And I think it's like anything else. If you have already kind of experienced something before it really happens to you, doesn't mean that you're not going to have an accident, doesn't mean that you're protected, but it certainly gives you a higher level of confidence that you can handle something that unexpectedly arises because, oh, okay, I know that I'm supposed to try to keep the weight distributed across all four wheels here, or I know that I may, if I start feeling the ABS kicking in, that's okay. If I really need to keep it activated and stop, um, or they may say, yeah, I don't need the ABS. Maybe I hit the brakes a little bit too hard. I can modulate the
Right.
pressure of the brake pedal and
Well,
get.
to give you one final example, um, we put our youngest son back when he was 15 and a half, 16 through a teen driving course. And before he got his license, we were out in our Ford Expedition, which was the vehicle he had driven in the teen driving course. And we're just going along past the shopping center, and he had learned to basically scan and sort of look for threats coming in from side streets, especially coming past the shopping center. So, guy in a BMW convertible basically has a stop sign, doesn't stop, rolls it, and I'm looking at my son, and he had already moved his foot, and he's doing about 35, 40. He'd already moved his foot over the brake pedal. And as soon as he saw the guy's wheels turn basically a quarter turn, that he was not going to stop and wait, he went full on the brakes. And you saw the guy in the BMW convertible turn like this, eyes get big as saucers because he's staring at a very large SUV bearing down on his door.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, Richard stopped in plenty of time. He probably had at least 50 feet of clearance from the guy.
Mm-hmm.
But you saw the guy sort of put his hand up like, hey, thanks for not killing me today.
Yeah, that was my fault. Sorry. Thank you for being aware of what your environment was. And we've all been there as a driver. We zone out and maybe we're focused on something farther down the road. We don't see the closest vehicle, or we think we have more time than we do because we misjudge the speed that the vehicle is approaching.
Exactly. But
So yeah,
again, the fact that he'd been through the course and knew what to do,
yeah,
prevented a potential tragedy.
exactly. Well, on that note, be aware of your environment and drive defensively, as they say. Always anticipate the other person doing the wrong thing versus the right thing. And that's been kind of my rule of thumb that I've always used as a driver. And I've instilled that into my kids. My wife does the same thing. So, it's
Yeah.
saved our bacon a few times. And, don't be in a hurry to jump the light as soon as it turns green. If it's a four-way light, you maybe just want to pause a second and scan the intersection, make sure nobody's looking down at their phone and flying through the intersection, because it just takes a moment to have a tragedy.
Yes.
So again, thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends, neighbors, wake up the dog, as David Letterman used to say, about brothers in cars. And we look forward to seeing you the next time.